music. It's wonderful. I particularly like the song Forever Young. Now that I'm pushing, well, somebody the other day said, who in the Lord's name would want to be 90? And I said, somebody who's 89. It's coming, but it was just gorgeous to hear. I'm so happy to see you all. This is no comment on my backsliding attendance, but I haven't seen you for quite a time. And it's pleasant to have you back, pleasant to be here. So this was an interesting charge to talk about Wyoming, the equality state. It's an interesting sort of concept. Let me go back to the times when I was teaching a little course at the University of Wyoming called Wyoming's Political Identity. Had some wonderful students in it. And another course called Wyoming Futures. And a lot of those students were from Bighorn Basin, a couple of outstanding ones from Cody. And they're all, I surmise, doing well. Alan joined me, and we team taught it. And I can remember when it was announced to the professoriate there in the political science department that Al and I were going to teach this class, all the blood drained from the professors' faces. But we made it, they accepted us, and we had a wonderful time, particularly because of the students. Well, this question of Wyoming, the equality state, I was going to hand out something, and I wonder if, because I think you might be interested in it, it's the slogans of every state in the Union. Wyoming is the only state that has two slogans, and it says the equality state or the cowboy state. It's the only state that has those two prospects. I'm going to give this to good volunteers like David. That can't be good. Here, I'll give you the. That's great. I think you'd get a kick out of it. So I'm going. Let's get that. Here you go.
I'll share with David.
That's great. Thank you. That's super. Thank you. You'll know some of the craziest slogans you ever saw, like the Yellow Hammer State for Alabama. What does that mean? And the Frontier State, and several other comments that you'd get a kick out of. But the Equality State or Cowboy State mantra is particularly confusing. And it was confusing for the class, because they debated about this for some time. I now have, in a teacher's mode, another handout, which I will get to you as soon as my sturdy volunteers have passed out the first handout. There's no homework here. You will not have to respond. This is all, and if it makes you cry, yes. This one here. One of the things this handout says is, how can you say that Wyoming is the equality state if by federal and state, particularly workforce services statistics, which you will see here anon, Wyoming is second from the last in pay equality. Only Louisiana comes last of the 50 states. In Wyoming, it's 64 cents for every dollar that a man makes in an equivalent job. So you can imagine how the students fired up about that particular statistic and other things like, well, when was the first woman elected to the national delegation to Congress in the United States? Well, Barbie Cuban, in our memory, 1995. The first woman to be elected to the state legislature wasn't until 1911. The number of women in the state legislature has averaged roughly 7 over a period since 1924. And today we have 9 in the legislature. So there was As Al Larson, the historian laureate of Wyoming, has put it, lightning struck once, but it never struck again. And one of the things that's indicative of that as well, in 1871, the legislature in 1869 passed the Equal Suffrage Amendment. By the way, it was fairly easy to do that compared to if Wyoming had been a state. If you were a state, you'd have to go through a constitutional convention. You'd have to have a vote on it by the public, an amendment attached or something like it. But as a territorial legislature, it only needed a majority of votes between the two houses to pass equal suffrage. It still was a labor for the legislature to pass it. A barkeep out of South Pass by the name of William Bright took a resolution to the state legislature in 1869, which provided equal suffrage for women. And when they asked him why he did that, he said, this is sort of an argument from the justice of it, he said, I did it because my wife, who, by the way, was 20 years his junior, we won't even stop there, and his mother, he said, both of them should have had an equal right to vote if reconstructed slaves in the South had the right to vote. But the real argument in the legislature was whether it might attract more people to this sparse and desolate state at the time, particularly when there was some ambition to become a state. And by the original constitutional provision, you had to have 20,000 people. We had 16, which was close, but the Union Pacific had just completed its work, and as a consequence, the population in Wyoming went from 16,000 to 8,000 almost overnight. So there was some desperation in the legislature about what would be attractive to people to come west. The notion that it might take something like women being able to vote was argued pretty persuasively by the secretary of the territory, a guy by the name of Edward Lee, who later became governor and was a suffragist, not a suffragette, a suffragist. And he lobbied very successfully in the council, which finally voted, the council was the upper house, which finally voted 6-2 that they would pass that on to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, a recalcitrant by the name of Ben Sheeks was deadly opposed to it on the grounds that it would demean women. It would reduce their status. They would be subject to the, quote, dirty pool of politics, end of quote. And that it would be all to their benefit if they failed to pass women's suffrage. But the work of Edward Lee, particularly, the Secretary of the Territory, was tantamount to success. And the House of the Legislature passed it 7-4. Pretty close. So it was then signed into law by then Governor Campbell, and the women's rights movement around the country was ecstatic. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I remembered that, published a praise of Wyoming in the Women's Journal, which was a magazine sponsored by the women's movement. And Susan B. Anthony, in public speeches, urged every time she spoke women to move to Wyoming, where you were, quote, free to have a voice. Now, in the passion of that moment, in 1871, other laws were passed which were also surprisingly ahead of their time. There was a law passed that gave women equal rights to their own property, that gave them the opportunity and permission to go into entrepreneurship or business and also keep their earnings. There was a law that would prohibit mortgage debts to be filed against the spouse, the woman's spouse in the family, unless the woman had signed it voluntarily. So there were some exciting things that were coming out of the legislature in 1869, 1870, and 1871. So it was a time to ring bells. It was a time to cheer. It was a time for women to take ease and pleasure in the results. Now, did it accomplish its task? No. People didn't come to Wyoming. Women who did come were generally still subject to some of the problems they had faced in the East. How many times are those who come west able to escape the baggage they left behind? So there were problems for them when they came. But it was still a talisman of women's rights at a time when no one else had done it. There was, as Al Larson said, no great success after that. But I think it's appropriate to diverge only for a second to take on or to talk about Esther Morris as the talisman, the statue in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C., to the woman who is associated with the founding, the mother of women's rights and equal rights in Wyoming. She was a wonderful lady by all accounts, almost 6 foot tall, which was a surprise, and a bit, as Grace Raymond Hebert, the historian, mentioned, a bit mannish, probably needed to be at that time. It's like the old phrase that out west here in Wyoming, where men are men and women are too. So she was a power, but the story that Grace Raymond Hebert perpetuated was that there was a tea party. You've heard it. It's like the George Washington apple tree story. There was a tea party at which Esther Morris inveigled William Wright to come up with the resolution for equal suffrage in the state legislature. I hate to tell you, as I've always hated to think about George Washington not chopping down the cherry tree, that it is not true. She didn't meet Wright until after that event had occurred. She then had him over, didn't have him over the house, but went to his house, as her son wrote years later, to congratulate him on promoting the amendment, the resolution, and seeing it through to passage. So that was the first time they had seen each other. But still, that doesn't diminish her role in terms of how she then proceeded to take up the position among 3 nominees for Justice of the Peace in Wyoming, the only one truly qualified. She took on the first Justice of the Peace role in the state of Wyoming and served admirably in that capacity. A couple of 3 assault and battery cases, only 1 murder case, which was remanded to the higher court. And she was formidable, honest, direct, and successful. But only 8.5 months of the term, and nobody in either party nominated her to return. Strangely enough, that's the same sort of climate that occurred in 1871 when the Equal Rights Amendment provided the first vote. And the women voted for the first time. And they voted a Republican into office instead of a Democrat. And the Democrats, who had been the ones that had forwarded the resolution in the state legislature, got exceptionally upset and introduced a bill to repeal the equal rights provision for the state of Wyoming. That barely failed. And if it weren't for Governor Lee, who then was governor, it would have. So he vetoed the prospect, and the Equal Rights Amendment, the equal suffrage law stayed. There were things that passed through the gate after that, and the fortunes of the equal rights law in Wyoming declined rapidly. There was an effort to put jurors, women jurors, in juries across the state. That provision had been provided too, along with the equal property rights and equal pay for teachers law, which was passed. But the provision for jurors was abandoned 4 years later, and we never got another woman juror on the jury until 1952. When we talk about the first governor in the United States, Governor Nellie Taylor Ross, who had won the office in a special election after the death of her husband against a fellow by the name of Frank Lucas, who was the Secretary of State and the natural successor to William Ross. And when she won, that too was excitement all across the country in the women's rights movement. And it was a stupendous success for those in the Democratic Party, of which she was one. She, however, suffered the same identical fate when she ran again to be elected in the next regularly scheduled election. Women rose up and decided she had not done enough for women, per se, in her term in the state legislature. So it was a tough ride. By the way, I have up here, and this is a sidebar, but it sure excited us in the House, our House, not the House of Representatives. We have gone through 50,000 metric tons of papers and boxes and, how do you say it, the crap you collect as you go through life. But occasionally a real jewel comes up, and in this case it did. It was a torn and sort of beaten up certificate. And I'm going to pass it around. We had it duplicated and laminated, and I'd like to have you see it. It says Certificate of Election, State of Wyoming Executive Department. Whereas according to the official returns of a general election held in the state of Wyoming on the 2nd day of November AD 1926, regularly transmitted to the Office of Secretary of State and duly canvassed by the State Board of Canvassers, it appears that Millward L. Simpson was lawfully elected member of the House of Representatives of the state of Wyoming, signed by Nellie Taylor Ross. It's a wonderful. We're going to give it to the American Heritage Center, but there's a replica of it. You can imagine the excitement of finding that in the dusty bin there in the house. Also, on a personal note in that regard, women's suffrage did extend to the passion that my Aunt Doris Coy, who was the sister of our mother, who was if there was anybody who looked more mannish, I can't imagine. She could make me 12 years old when I was 60. She was a formidable woman, a real powerhouse, and she was the first national delegate of the Republican Party, first woman national delegate of the Republican Party from Sheridan, Wyoming. She also was the first board member on a bank board in the county of Sheridan, if not in the entire state of Wyoming, when dear old, oh gosh, what's his name, Al? The chairman of the Bank of Commerce. No, it was Homer Scott. I need every octogenarian in the house to help with these memory things. Okay, Homer Scott. Homer Scott didn't like that. He'd never served with a woman who had. And he actually said it one day in exasperation because Aunt Doris was always probing, always nicking him, always asking nasty questions, details, all that stuff. Finally, he said, well, I've never served on the board with a woman. And Aunt Doris said, well, I've never served on a board that had anything but damn men. he decided to change the meeting times. And so he met at 6 in the morning, hoping that she would not come. She came every time. She was some kind of lady. And on another personal note, the first woman sheriff in Wyoming was Al's and my third cousin removed, Pearl Hupp, in Jackson, at the same time that the first all-woman city council held sway in Jackson. Another part of the surge for women's rights that occurred around 1870, 1880, and beyond. But as Al Larson said, it wasn't women's suffrage that brought people to Wyoming and assured statehood. It was the cowboy who came to make a living, the only one who came to stay, the one who used the free range and developed an economy and became the core of our early statehood efforts. Now that's a whole different story, a whole other time, but I had always hoped that the cowboy, which seems to be eternal, would be an eternal symbol. But guess what some of my classes said? Because they read the book by Sam Western called Pushed Off the Mountain, Sold Down the River. It's a very interesting and controversial book which maintains that we're subject to our mythology, the cowboy myth, and we don't move off dead center. We're living in the past. In fact, one of our students said, well, why don't we make it a racehorse? Because a bucking bronc just goes up and down. We want to get ahead. And the Sam Western's contention is that we don't have a very large stake ourselves in Wyoming society because we had the mineral industry, which went from cowboy state to miners state, mineral state. Well, you can see what the implications would be, how we get a stake in our society. Would we all like to pay an income tax? That's why I'm going to kill Sam Western. But the point is well taken. So equality as a slogan for the state of Wyoming versus the cowboy as a slogan for the state of Wyoming. Let me ask you all to chip in. And I will ask a question I asked the class. How many of you would prefer equality as the slogan and mantra of the state of Wyoming, even though it might not be as marketable as the cowboy? How many would approve of that? I love you church-going people. And how many would approve, and this is not in any way a denigration, and I don't want to dissuade you, of the immortal cowboy, steamboat with either Clayton Danks or Tyrell or however many have ridden him on top on our license plates ever since 1936, by the way. How many would approve? How many would like that to be the only slogan? We are churchgoers, all of us. We believe in equality and in equal rights. Well, look, I want to open it up for questions and comments and discussion, if you would like to do that, which can be fruitful or disastrous, whichever way it might be. I'd be interested. That's all I have. I had to go through. I wanted to do. Hang on, just a minute. This, by the way, everybody, if you have not access, this is an elegant little book. This is the book that Al Larson wrote as a commission on the bicentennial of America. Every state came up with a history of the state, a small, readable one. So instead of the very large Al Larson book on the history of Wyoming, which many of you are nodding, that was a tough one to get through, this is a beautiful little book. Short, highly readable, really a fine thing. It's simply Wyoming, a history by T.A. Al Larson. And in there's one thing that I wish to read related to the equal rights move in the state. And by the way, it was 1975, wasn't it, Wyoming passed voted for the Constitutional Equal Rights Amendment. There was a fierce debate on that one as well. And people finally came to realize that if we in any way can call ourselves the equality state, it would be very embarrassing not to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1975. And the mover and shaker was none other than Thyra Thompson, who was Secretary of State for so many years. She promoted it, pushed it, and made it happen. She was a wonderful, spicy lady. I remember that they one time drew a cartoon of her in the Casper Star-Tribune during an election when her son was running to imply that he was hiding behind her apron strings, and drew a picture of her. And someone asked her, "Did that make you angry, Thyra?" And she said, "Yes, because he made me look flat-chested." Okay, this is the phrase I wanted to read. In retrospect, in the man's world of Wyoming territory, the idea that votes for women would attract people proved to be invalid. It was more effective to let it be known that young men could find employment as cowboys. The cattlemen had very little to do with bringing women's suffrage to Wyoming. They were not represented in the first legislature and rarely became enthusiastic about women's rights, but they had much to do with building the economic base necessary for statehood. They could make something of the great American desert when others could not. So that's the story of our state's dilemma between equality and cowboys. And again, I welcome comments, suggestions, praise, disgust, domestic problems at home, whatever is on your mind.